Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Vraks. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex has gotten quite lucky so far. His offensive was, by no standards, a masterstroke, and it seems unlikely that it will be entering into the pages of the Tactica Imperialis anytime soon. But he had arrived at just the right time. And, on many occasions, success on the battlefield is as reliant upon luck as planning. And Lord Hector Rex had chosen the perfect time to make his dramatic entry. The defenders of Vraks were finally beginning to run out of the very resources that allowed them to fight on for over a decade. The massive armory stockpiles beneath Vraks that had supplied the defenders with all they had required for so very, very long were beginning to run dry. The rebels had attempted to compensate for their ever-dwindling stock by producing their own material of war, and whilst to some extent it had been a successful procedure, the continuous attention of the Imperial Navy had made it a costly one, and in no way able to replenish the losses suffered every day on the front lines. And as a result of seemingly endless shortages, constant retreats, and repeated setbacks, the morale of the defenders was finally starting to waver. Their cause may have been an infernal one, motivated by the power-hungry greed of an apostate cardinal, but no one could fault the Vraksians' efforts in defending their homeworld. They had acquitted themselves far beyond the expectations of anyone on either side of the conflict. They had fought with an unflinchingly tenacious spirit that did not waver even in the face of repeated withdrawals and constant, torturous defensive operations. They had displayed a skill and ability to adapt that had left Imperial commanders shocked. These mere PDF and auxiliary troops had held off one of the mightiest Imperial armies in the galaxy for over a decade. They had withstood the repeated onslaughts of the Death Corps of Krieg. They had stood up to the Dark Angels and even the Titans of Legio Astorum. And it was only through a monstrous expenditure of material, manpower, and energy that the Imperium was finally winning the war on Vraks. If the situation had been different, and the defenders of Vraks were fighting off some insidious alien threat, no doubt the planet and its population would have been remembered as heroes of the Imperium that held out for an incredible amount of time against overwhelming, insurmountable odds. But unfortunately, both for the Imperium and the population of Vraks, the situation was not different. And the lives of every single man, woman, and child on the planet had all been irreversibly doomed by the actions of the apostate cardinal. And through his further actions, their very souls had also become tainted. A taint that could only be cleansed by the mercy of the God Emperor. But even that small mercy was about to be taken from them, as a far more dire force had begun to rise on the planet. Ever since the arrival of their off-world allies, the war had taken on a new and even darker tone. A tone that was set to be made all the worse for the actions of a cornered warlord called Zuhfor. Up until this point, Zuhfor and the other Chaos leaders had viewed the apostate cardinal as a tool, a means through which they could retain control of the Vraksian defenders and ensure their continued loyalty and assistance. As long as the mortal defenders of Vraks continued to resist, the Chaos Space Marines were free to pursue the war in whatever manner they so wished. They could attack where they wanted, fight how they wanted, and execute their greater desires and objectives at their leisure. But now that the defenders were showing signs of cracking under the irresistible pressure of the Imperium, the Chaos Space Marines' own positions were beginning to be threatened. Zuhfor was not done with this war yet. He intended to wring every last drop of blood out of the conflict before he would begin looking for his escape plan. And, since the Cardinal clearly no longer commanded the full loyalty of his men, there was no longer any need to carry on with the pretense that the Chaos Forces obeyed or even respected him in any way, shape, or form. But before the Cardinal could be tossed aside, Zuhfor would have to solidify his own power base. He was not the only warlord on the planet, and if he truly wished to continue the war to its bitter end, he would require the forces of the other leaders as well. But whether he acquired those forces through cooperation or subjugation was a distinction without a difference as far as Zuhfor was concerned. He would start by bringing the two other large Khanate warbands under his command. Zuhfor's own Skulltakers were one of three major group of Khanate berserkers on the planet. The second was the Berserkers of Vraks, and the third would be the Sanctified. The most straightforward of the two would undoubtedly be the Berserkers. A traditional Khanate warband. All Zuhfor would have to do to take command over them was challenge their current leader to an honored duel. The loser would die, and the winner would gain command over both warbands. And with Zuhfor being big, even for a Chaos Space Marine, and a veteran of hundreds of years of warfare, he was quite confident about his chances. And indeed, it did not take long before the previous leader of the Berserkers of Vraks lay bleeding out on the field. It was now or never if anyone else wanted to challenge Zuhfor's right to leadership, but even Khanate berserkers have a small amount of self-preservation instinct. After all, they could hardly offer up a great quantity of skulls to Khorne if they were killed here and now, and so no one stepped forth to challenge Zuhfor's role as a leader. The Sanctified, however, were a slightly different proposition. There was a bit too much of the word-bearers in that warband for Zuhfor's liking, and something like an honor duel would probably not be binding. Even if he were to claim the skull of their leader, odds were that the remainder of the warband would be inclined to follow his directions, preferring instead to continue to pursue their own pointless demon-summoning ways. But luckily, Zuhfor possessed a kind of currency that the Sanctified would never be able to resist. The true name of a demon, and not just any demon, but the Guardian of the Throne of Skulls. The most powerful bloodthirster in the entirety of Khorne's vast warband. How precisely a mere Khanate warlord had acquired such arcane knowledge is up to speculation, but many have theorized that Zuhfor's presence on Vraks was no mere accident, that he was the pawn of a far more insidious creature, Abaddon, the Harmless. Hey, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and it would appear that Failbadon had for once happened upon a halfway decent plan. And whilst I am sure that an entire platoon of porky piglets were winging their happy little asses past Abaddon's window when he came up with it, that does not change the fact that Zuhfor was the right man in the right place at the right time. He wished to extend the war, and the Sanctified wished to bring the children of the Blood God into the material realm. and Zuhfor possessed the true name of one of the most favored of all of those children, along with a plentiful supply of sacrifices. The Sanctified would never allow such an opportunity to pass them by, and if they must temporarily subjugate themselves to some muscle-bound cornered brainlet to achieve it, then so be it. No doubt they could outsmart Zuhfor at some point further down the road. And with the 3 largest cornered warbands under his command, all the various smaller ones immediately joined up with Zuhfor, knowing full well the alternative. With that complete, Zuhfor then went on to introduce the rest of the Chaos warbands on the planet to their options when it came to dealing with the new power structure. He decided to demonstrate the first option on the Black Brethren of Ares, another Chaos Space Marine warband that quite suddenly and without warning found itself bereft of both its warlord and its first champion. The rest of the members of the warband found themselves equally suddenly surrounded by an uncomfortable quantity of cornered berserkers. They were then subsequently introduced to the second option: submit to Zuhfor's will, and maybe, just maybe, they would live. Such a display of careful, artistic, diplomatic intrigue warms the cockles of my cold, dead inquisitorial heart. And of course, swayed by the eloquence and righteousness of Zuhfor's cause, the Black Brethren unanimously decided to join their new glorious leader in his conquest of the planet. And naturally, the other warbands on Vraks also swiftly chose to follow the Black Brethren's example, lest they too be exposed to the oratory of the Skulltakers. The only holdout was the Alpha Legion warband under the command of Lord Arkos. Arkos refused to submit his own men to the direction of Lord Zuhfor. However, Lord Arkos understood that Zuhfor was in a position of considerable virtue. Might does make right, after all, and so offered instead to join with Zuhfor in an alliance as a junior partner. And in return for allowing his warband to roam relatively free, he would give Zuhfor a gift. The Alpha Legion was privy to the whereabouts and the security measures surrounding the apostate Cardinal, and Lord Arkos figured that now that the Cardinal no longer commanded the absolute loyalty of the Vraxian defenders, he only had one last role to play. Namely, of course, the role of an example. Whereas previously the defenders of Vraks had fought in the name of their Cardinal due to the misguided belief that he was their savior, their messiah, indeed, as he had pronounced himself, now they would instead fight so as to avoid his fate. And Zuhfor, seeing the value of making such an example of the Cardinal, eagerly agreed, figuring that if the Alpha Legion ever got too annoying, well, the balance of power would hardly change in the future, and the Alpha Legion should be kept close for the time being so as to better be able to dispose of them should they ever prove duplicitous. And speaking of betrayal, the Alpha Legion not only handed over the apostate Cardinal's location, they also offered to take care of his guards, and the majority of the disciples of Zephyr. Zuhfor somewhat naively accepted this as well, figuring that it would allow him to retain all of his own fighting forces, whilst perhaps whittling down the Alpha Legion just a little bit. What he did not count on was that the Alpha Legion's definition of the disciples of Zephyr was a wide one indeed, and whilst getting rid of the Cardinal's bodyguards and security measures, they also killed his command staff. The very same command staff that had previously kept a hold over the Vraxian defenders and had provided the Imperial attackers with so many headaches. No good deed ever truly goes unpunished, and the Alpha Legion had clearly decided that the mortal commanders were a little bit too competent for their liking. With them still in charge, Zuhfor might be tempted to let them stay in charge, and as such limit the authority of the Alpha Legion, who had been running a considerable portion of the war on behalf of the Cardinal. But if that very same command staff became an unfortunate victim of the zeal of the Alpha Legion and a lack of detail put down in the Alpha Legion's cooperation with the Skull Takers, then, well, Zuhfor would have no other option but to allow the Alpha Legion to continue to operate large portions of the Vraxian defenders. Unless, of course, Lord Zuhfor would like to watch over the mortals instead? No, I didn't think so. Cardinal Zaphon had started his revolt with grand plans indeed. He was to launch a crusade of the faithful to sweep the Scarra sector clean of heresy and all who would oppose him. He was to be the Messiah, the Saviour, the Redeemer of the Imperium of Man. He ended his days as a decoration on Zuhfor's altar dedicated to the Blood God, as but one skull out of thousands. If it were not for the fact that the Cardinal had been stark raving mad for several years at this point, he may have appreciated the irony of his previous dreams of launching a crusade to rid the Scarra sector of all heretical and chaos influence, whilst now his very flesh, blood, and skull was used to build up a ginormous altar that would serve as a warp gate to bring those very same demons he had once sought to exterminate into the mortal world. Of the Cardinal's faithful followers and his inner circle, practically none remained. The Alpha Legion did, however, make one mistake, in that they let Deacon Mamoon escape and joined the Nurgle warbands to the east. Although whether or not the Alpha Legion truly made a mistake or not, well, that is open to interpretation. Because their little accident meant that Zuhfor would never truly extend his control all the way over to the worshippers of Nurgle. They may pay lip service to Zuhfor's aims, but they were still very much so intent on furthering their own goals first. And if those aims were brought fully to fruition, then it wouldn't matter how many warp gates Zuhfor opened, or how many thousands of bleating mortals he sacrificed to his god. Because in the end, the planet itself would be claimed by an entirely different entity. The good deacon had found himself a new master, and this one was of a far more permanent sort than the Cardinal. A far more grateful one as well, as Grandfather Nurgle of course loves all of his children, but Mamoon in particular had rendered great service to the Plague Father. He had turned Vraks into a charnel pit, and subsequently into a putrid, festering garden most pleasing to Nurgle's eye. For this, Nurgle granted him the ultimate reward of demonhood, elevating him to a demon prince and making him a host to one of Nurgle's most favoured children, the Great Unclean Ones. This rather radical change in leadership, both on the side of Zuhfor taking over command of all the Vraxian defenders and the Citadel forces, and Mamoon entering into the high leadership of the Nurgle side, would lead to an equally radical change in the war on Vraks. So far, the war had been fought primarily by the mere mortal followers of both parties, The Death Korps of Krieg had only been partially and temporarily supported by the God Emperor's Astartes, whilst the defenders had received indirect and highly independent support by Chaos Space Marines. Those forces, however, did whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, in whatever fashion they wanted. They waged their own private war with their own private concerns, leaving the bulk of the fighting and the duty of actually holding the front line to the mortal followers and their commanders. There were one or two exceptions to this rule, like the Iron Warriors, for example, who simply moved into a section of the front line and dared anyone to challenge their occupation of it, and of course the Eastern Front, where the worshippers of Nurgle had dug in. And no man, heretical or otherwise of sound mind, would want to spend more time than absolutely necessary in such odious company. The Eastern Front, however, was to be a small taste of what was to come. Now that the entire war was commanded by the zealous followers of various chaos powers, things were about to take a turn for the worse. Previously, no matter how dark and unlikely such a prospect may have appeared, the Vraksian defenders had fought for victory. Not necessarily the defeat of the Imperial armies, but perhaps at least a stalemate that would force some sort of accord with the Imperium. And of course, the more fanatical followers of their now deceased messiah never gave up hope that they would eventually triumph, for, after all, they were righteous, and evil never triumphs over righteousness, right? That would simply be bad form. But now, the war would no longer be fought for any sort of hope of a peace, or of an accord, or even such lofty ideals like righteousness or victory. Where once the war had been a means to an end, now the end was the war. The war in and of itself was the point. The war in and of itself was the goal, and nothing mattered but to extend the war for as long as possible. To extend the human suffering and human sacrifice for as long as possible. And it mattered not one teensy-weensy bit to its new commanders on which side that suffering and loss was inflicted. And whereas the apostate cardinal and his command structure had been hesitant to employ some of the more controversial means at their disposal, like the TP3 gas, for example, as the followers of Nurgle had already demonstrated, the new commanders of the war were considerably less scrupulous, and they had access to other means of waging war that the Cardinal could not have dreamed of in his worst nightmares. And Zuhfor, along with the sanctified warband of demomancers, were already working on rectifying one of the Vraksians' primary concerns: the lack of combatants with which to extend the war. Luckily, the Sanctified had an idea or two about where one might find some very eager volunteers to rectify this problem. And all it would require was the sacrifice of something that Vraks still had in abundance, namely, of course, non-combatants. And to be honest, they weren't of much use for anything else, now that the factories had all been bombed to bits by the Imperial Navy. But the sacrifices and the rituals would take time. The Death Korps of Krieg would have to be kept at bay for a little longer before Zuhfor's designs could be fully realized. And so, conventional warfare would have to continue at least for a little while. And Zuhfor was taking a risk here. His coup had been swift and almost unconditionally successful, with the exception of the occasional Alpha Legion interference. But nevertheless, organizing everything that was to be required for the rituals, and also making sure that the other Chaos Warlords did not get any ideas relating to coups of their own, would keep his cornered berserkers busy for quite a while. If the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army made a determined and violent push now, it could see the entire Chaos frontline collapse, bringing a premature halt to the rituals currently being carried out by the Sanctified. Unfortunately for the 88, for all of their new Inquisitorial support, none of the Inquisitors or any of their adepts were able to divine the intentions of Zuhfor and his followers. And to make matters worse, Lord Hector Rex was about to experience the interference from his Inquisitorial colleagues ever since failing to rally all the Inquisitors to his cause after the Scarus Conclave. And what those consequences might be, you will find out in the next episode. Sorry for a bit of a short one this week, and only just a single short one as well. My throat's been bothering me a little bit lately, after returning from the Dark Continent and having a nice big cold wave up here in Norway. I've decided to play it a little bit careful. I wouldn't want to ruin my voice now that we are so very close to the end of the Siege of Vraks. So, until next time, I, as always, have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.